Hi, I just wanted to give an example of, as a student in UCL, of a man who's a racist, who's celebrated in the university. His name is Francis Galton. There's a collection after his name, there's a lab after his name, there's even a lecture theatre after his name. What is the basis for these men to be celebrated when black academics, black alumni are not given that basis? There is no basis for black academics or alumni to be celebrated in this campus, while racists such as Francis Galton are overly celebrated without even mentioning the racism in their writing. And as a student, we were never taught that these people are racist. We're only taught they're polymath, they're the most influential men in the history of Britain, but we have to do our own research to find out that these men hate us. So, yeah.
You're not the first person to make that point to me, by the way. My only defense is I inherited him.
I was introduced to Francis Galton as a polymath, as a great man who is of immense importance to the sciences, especially psychology of individual differences. So I wanted to look at what he had to say about individual differences in ethnicity, or did he ignore that? But when I researched it online, this wasn't provided to us in lectures, I found his essay or his letter, Africa for the Chinese. He goes into explicit details on what he thinks of people that he views as inferior to the Anglo-Saxon white race. And he just makes an assumption that everyone is inferior. Even the Chinaman that he says is the best option to displace the people of Africa, which he thinks he literally says, the gain would be immense to the whole civilized world if we were to outbreed and finally displace the N-word as completely as the latter had displaced the Aborigines of the West Indies. I was really shocked when walking around UCL, seeing his collection, Francis Galton's collection, seeing a lecture theatre named after him, and I just wondered, like, on what basis does this university celebrate him? I mean, I want to know what I'm not denying that he was a polymath, but I want to know what good has he contributed to people like me and other students who have been dehumanized by his science.
My name is Subhadra, and I am the curator of the Galton Collection here at UCL. Francis Galton was a scientist. He was born in 1822 and died in 1911, so he's pretty much as Victorian as you can get. Most people have probably never even heard of him. If they have, it's because they know that he's the man who came up with the idea of eugenics. This particular drawer shows us some of the personal effects of the man, and it's the same as kind of any historical collection. You get an idea of who he is as a person. You get the idea that he's probably a little bit finicky because we've got things like mirrors and combs, mending kits. But the collection also contains objects to do with Galton's work. And these are some very iconic objects. So this, for example, if I move my movement form out of the way, is a craniometer, which was used to measure people's heads. And you can measure in different planes. So you can take a measurement from here to here, or in profile, for example, at set points across a person's features. The Galton Collection is a historic museum collection which includes the personal effects of Sir Francis Galton and also the objects that relate to his work. So his very early prototypes working on certain projects and objects that he would have used in the pursuance of his science. It also includes objects from the Galton Laboratory, which was set up at UCL in 1904. And there are things that have been added into the collection since then. For example, we know that Carl Pearson, who was Galton's disciple in a way, he was his acolyte and a strong base here at the university, added things into the laboratory that then became part of the museum collection over the course of the early half of the 20th century. There are certainly things that have come in after that point as well. But it was something he was interested fundamentally in, understanding the effects of the environment had on the way someone grew up versus their genetic inheritance. He was very firmly on one side of that argument, but he was nonetheless interested in measuring the different aspects of how that made up an individual. It's generally known that Galton was racist in his approach to understanding humans and understanding human society and biology. The objects in this collection relate to that work that he did with biometrics, with anthropometrics, measuring people. And the objects that are used here relate also to the work of the Galton laboratory before it came to UCL and after, in terms of measuring people. But they are interesting because they exemplify the work that was done on people who came voluntarily to be measured, but they're still the same objects that were used on people all around the world who didn't necessarily consent to that process in the same way.
I'm Carole Reeves, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at UCL. Eugen Fischer was a German professor of medicine, anthropology and eugenics. Now, like many anthropologists of his time working at the turn of the 20th century, he was interested in race and its associated ideas of the evolutionary superiority and inferiority of peoples. The success of white middle-class Europeans in colonising and subjugating indigenous peoples was believed to reflect their evolutionary and racial superiority. And Fischer conducted field research in German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, in 1908, using instruments designed to scientifically measure race and, by implication, inferiority. These included head spanners to measure skull shapes and size, eye and hair colour scales, and of course this is the hair colour scale that he created. This hair gauge, manufactured in about 1905 to the design of the anthropologist Eugen Fischer, is important because it contributed to the making of a science of race. The hair scale supposedly represented all the races of the world in a hierarchical manner, from flaxen blonde to deep black. It was designed to be a scientific measuring instrument, a standard hair scale, and as such, all race scientists could invest in its truth. And the truth, as far as hair was concerned, was that black, wavy, and so-called woolly hair belonged to the inferior races of the world, people of the southern Mediterranean, Middle East, Asia, and above all, Africa. Wool is the hair of animals, and in humans, it was supposed to denote a status way down the evolutionary scale, up from the ape, but only just.
I'm Debbie Challis. I work at the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, University College London. We're in the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology. The Petrie Museum is named after its founding archaeologist, William Matthew Flinders Petrie. He's sometimes known as the father of scientific archaeology, partly because he brought in new methodologies to archaeology in terms of stratification, sequence dating, using photography. Part of his interest in science meant that he also had an interest in so-called racial science, and he was very influenced by Francis Galton. In fact, he was a kind of protege of Francis Galton's. Galton helped him in his early stages of his career. He helped him get his first book published through the Royal Geographical Society. He then, when Petrie went freelance, when he fell out with the Egyptian Exploration Fund, Galton actually gave him his first gig, if you like, taking photographs of racial types on Egyptian monuments. In the book that Galton defined eugenics in 1883, he mentions Flinders Petrie as having this superb mathematical mind. It's clear from letters between them that they had this connection and this interest, this shared interest in race. It's a draw of heads representing so-called racial types. Petrie excavated these or bought them at a site called Memphis, which is quite near modern-day Cairo. And he thought that all these different heads represented a racial type carefully recorded by Greek artists working in Memphis at about 300 to 0 BC. When I first started working at the Petrie Museum, it was this drawer that got me interested in Petrie's ideas about race. And I realised, really looking at this drawer and then looking at a lot more of his writing, how deeply influenced he was by racial theory and so-called racial science for all of his work.
Well, these objects exist and have a history, and we need to tell that story. I first discovered Galton and eugenics when I was a student at UCL doing a master's degree in history and philosophy of science, and I was both irresistibly drawn and repelled by it. And in turn, I haven't yet met a student who doesn't go through the same emotions of fascination and incredulity when confronted with a hair scale or anything else in the Galton collection, particularly as Galton and Darwin were cousins, came out of the same family and had very similar values. But there's also an argument that eugenics is still with us in the form of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, female feticide, and sterilisation of drug users.
In order to become a post-racial society, we don't just ignore race and pretend that doesn't happen, like, oh, it's a social construct, racism doesn't really happen, because it does. And a lot of our institutions, a lot of our sciences, the gatekeepers of our knowledge are racist. And we don't really question that. We just think, oh, it was like they were part of their times, it was okay to be racist back then, but we're just going to take the good of their science, like this fingerprint technology, which was made to differentiate between Indians and the British Empire, because, quote unquote, they all look the same apparently, which is a deeply racist concept of homogenizing an entire people and not respecting their differences, or not humanizing them enough to pay enough attention to see that they're not all the same. But we can't just benefit from these technologies, from these privileges, while ignoring what they were built on.